Everyone knows the legend of Catherine the Great, the brilliant empress, the woman who ruled a continent, and the rumor too scandalous to repeat. But what if I told you that the truth behind that rumor reveals something far more disturbing? Not about her, but about the men who feared her? Catherine was born a powerless girl in a forgotten German duchy. She rose through manipulation, intelligence, and charm, until she became the most powerful woman in the world. And for that, history decided to punish her. Her enemies couldn't defeat her on the battlefield, so they attacked her in the bedroom, turning one of the greatest rulers of the Enlightenment into a myth of lust and shame. Tonight, we'll uncover what really happened: the power, the passion, the lie that refused to die. If you enjoy this kind of content, please like the video and subscribe. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Now let us step into the glittering world of Imperial Russia, where power and pleasure were often the same thing. When Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst first arrived in Russia, the air itself felt foreign. It bit through her clothes, heavy and metallic like the breath of something ancient. The carriage wheels cracked over the frozen cobblestones of St. Petersburg, and she pressed her small hands together to stop them from trembling. She was 17, too young to rule, but old enough to understand she had been sent here for one reason: to marry a man she didn't know in a country that didn't want her. The first thing she learned about the Russian court was silence. It wasn't the quiet of peace. It was the quiet of danger. Every glance could be a trap, every smile a test. Behind the velvet curtains and glittering chandeliers, the air reeked of candle wax, perfume, and fear. Her future mother-in-law, Empress Elizabeth, watched her like a hawk disguised in silk. Elizabeth was beautiful, powerful, and cruel in the way only the powerful can be. She wanted loyalty, not love. Sophie bowed, smiled, obeyed. Inside, she was taking notes. The second thing she learned was that in Russia, you could be devoured for standing still. Everyone was hungry, for titles, for land, for favor. Every gesture was a move on a board she barely understood. So Sophie became a mirror. She laughed when others laughed. She wept when others wept. She learned their games by playing along. When the priests asked her to abandon her Lutheran faith, she didn't hesitate. She stood in the glittering cathedral, the scent of incense burning her lungs, and repeated the vows they gave her. They poured holy oil across her forehead and gave her a new name: Catherine Alexeyevna. The crowd murmured approval, but she knew what it meant. Sophie was dead. Catherine was an invention. That night, she looked at herself in the mirror and whispered the name again: Catherine. It felt strange in her mouth, but powerful. A name that belonged to someone who could survive here. The palace was a world of mirrors, a place where truth bent and twisted under the weight of power. She saw courtiers smile to her face and then whisper behind her back. She saw women her age banished overnight for a careless word, and she realized something that would guide her for the rest of her life. In a world where everyone served someone else, the only safety lay in becoming indispensable. So she learned. She studied the customs, the gossip, the invisible laws that ruled the court better than the emperor himself. She learned Russian until her accent vanished. She memorized faces, alliances, betrayals. By day she smiled, flawless and quiet. By night she wrote in her journal little notes about what people wanted, what they feared. She didn't have friends. She didn't need them. She had information. And slowly, beneath the silk and courtesy, the fear began to harden into something colder: ambition. The girl who had once trembled in a carriage was learning to read the empire like a book. Every cruelty became a lesson, every insult a reason to rise higher. By the time winter melted into spring, the courtiers had stopped calling her the little German girl. They called her Catherine the Clever, not out of respect, not yet, but out of caution. They didn't know it, but history had just entered the room. It began quietly, not with a rebellion, but with a whisper in her own mind. One night, after another evening of humiliation, Catherine sat alone by the dying fire. The light flickered across her face, across the pages of a book she could barely read through her tears. It was Voltaire. He was writing about reason, about freedom, ideas meant for men, never for her. And yet, she understood every word. If no one will protect me, she thought, then I will become the one who cannot be hurt. From that moment, something changed. Catherine stopped waiting to be saved. She began to prepare for power, not the shallow power of her husband, but the quiet, invisible kind that survives storms. She started with language. She practiced Russian until she could speak it more elegantly than the nobles who mocked her. She wrote letters to ambassadors, pretending to ask innocent questions while measuring their loyalties. She met generals, priests, scholars, anyone with influence, and she remembered every detail: who hesitated, who flattered, who lied. In a world ruled by men, she made knowledge her weapon. Every night she read until the candles died. Every day she played her role, graceful, obedient, harmless. The courtiers began to underestimate her, and that was exactly what she wanted. While Peter shouted about war, Catherine built alliances in silence. She knew which noble families hated him, which officers were loyal only to their pay, which ministers feared losing their positions. She learned how gossip could destroy faster than any bullet. Information flowed to her like blood through veins. The little German girl was gone. In her place stood a woman made of patience and calculation. Then came the moment she had been waiting for. Peter inherited the throne, and within weeks began destroying himself. He insulted the army, dismissed powerful nobles, mocked the church, and spent his nights drinking with foreign officers. Catherine watched, unseen, as his allies turned restless. The empire was cracking, and she was ready to step through. She began meeting secretly with the Orlov brothers, strong, ambitious soldiers who admired her mind and her courage. They talked about loyalty, about the future of Russia, and about what might happen if the emperor were suddenly gone. Catherine didn't call it a plot, not yet. She called it a possibility. But inside, she knew. History was shifting. In June of 1762, Peter left for his military games at Oranienbaum. Catherine stayed behind, pale and calm, her hands steady as she wrote letters through the night. By dawn, the army had chosen their side. They weren't following Peter anymore. They were following her. When the guards came to escort her to the palace, she wore a simple riding uniform, green and gold, the colors of command. Witnesses said she moved through the corridors like someone who had already seen this moment in a dream. By noon, she stood before the assembled troops, holding the imperial banner. Her voice did not tremble. "Brothers," she said, "Russia has no emperor. Follow me, and she will have a mother." The soldiers knelt. The bells of St. Petersburg began to ring. And in that echo, between steel and silence, a girl named Sophie, from a small German duchy, became Catherine the Great. The winter palace smelled of wax, wine, and whispers. Every corridor carried laughter that was not sincere. After the coup, Catherine understood that ruling Russia was not about decrees. It was about perception, about making people believe she was unassailable. To survive, she needed loyalty. In a court where daggers hid behind bows, loyalty was bought less with gold than attention. Affection, proximity, the promise of favor, these were currencies stronger than coin. Catherine did not invent seduction as statecraft, she perfected it. She saw what most men in that palace could not. Desire creates leverage. Give someone what he craves and he will orbit. Withhold it, and he will burn. Her salons became weather vanes for power. Musicians tuned at dusk. Ambassadors measured the distance between a smile and an invitation. She laughed rarely, never idly. The fewer words she spoke, the more each word weighed. Rivals watched for weakness in her pleasures. She let them. While they counted glances, she counted votes in the Senate, signatures on orders, regiments that would ride at dawn. Scandal, she learned, is a veil, thin, bright, and useful. Then came Grigory Orlov, powder-smelling, scarred, direct. He saluted like a soldier, and talked like a bell that would not stop. Where courtiers asked what pleased her, Orlov asked what threatened her. That was new. He and his brothers had dragged the empire into her hands the morning the guards changed their oath. They expected reward. Russia expected calm. Catherine understood that satisfying both would require choreography, not surrender. With Orlov, she set a rule. Intimacy would feed authority, never drain it. He received promotions, honors, private hours, but always the message that favor served the crown, not the other way around. The palace murmured. Pamphlets sprouted like mildew. The Empress rules from her bed, they sneered. Catherine let the line travel, because a rumor marching in circles is a rumor not marching toward the barracks. Meanwhile, she worked. Taxes straightened, courts trimmed, governors replaced. She drafted the nakaz, her great instruction, smoothing barbarous edges with Enlightenment gloss. Letters flew to Paris. Philosophers replied with flattery and advice. Moscow grumbled. St. Petersburg glittered. In the ballroom, she wore light like armor. She chose dresses that told stories, crimson for resolve, ice blue for distance, gold when she wanted men to remember who minted coins. She did not drink much. She listened. And because she listened, she learned which noble houses were drowning in debt, which officers had wives who feared winter, which prelates liked to complain in Latin, thinking no one understood. She understood. Sometimes she withdrew from a conversation the moment a man leaned closer, leaving him suspended over his own desire. Sometimes she granted an audience earlier than anyone expected, so that gratitude arrived before the petition. Both tactics tethered. By spring, the court had accepted a paradox. The Empress could be seen, approached, even admired, but never owned. Her nearness intoxicated, her distance ruled. That was the point. Proximity created warmth, boundaries made orbit. Between them, Catherine built gravity. The court called it charm. She called it safety. And beneath the music, beneath the compliments and the grace, the machinery of rule kept turning, balanced and hers. For those who tried to read her heart like a ledger, Catherine offered legible lies. A laugh here, a glance there, a rumor left conveniently uncorrected. The real account books lived elsewhere, in dispatches, treaties, and the quiet lists she kept of debts paid and favors owed. Seduction, in her hands, was not romance. It was risk management. And in a city of watchers, the safest mask was the one everyone preferred to stare at. He entered her life like a drumbeat. No powdered wig, no perfumed phrases, just the smell of gunpowder and leather, and eyes that met hers without flinching. Grigory Orlov was 27, reckless, impossibly direct. He bowed too briefly. He spoke too loudly. He didn't seem to know that she was supposed to terrify him. That alone caught her attention. The court was a theater of fear, but Orlov didn't play his part. He treated her like a person, and that, in a palace of flatterers, felt revolutionary. He spoke of soldiers who hadn't been paid, of winter roads swallowed by snow, of villages that prayed to forget they existed. He didn't flatter. He informed. Catherine listened. For years she had lived surrounded by masks. Now here was a man who had none. He was blunt, impatient, and alive. And for a moment, a dangerous one, she allowed herself to enjoy the simplicity of being seen. Their alliance began as strategy. He had command of the guards. They adored him. He could turn the empire in a night, and she knew it, so she invited him often, first to councils, then to supper, then to silence. The night they first became lovers, she didn't call it love. She called it momentum. Orlov was not clever in the way of courtiers. He said what he thought, sometimes before thinking. But he had the kind of courage that could be aimed. Catherine aimed it. When Peter's reign collapsed, it was Orlov's regiment that filled the streets, his voice that shouted her name to the troops. He rode beside her as she took the crown. The empire changed hands in a single morning, and he handed her the sword that had made it possible. She rewarded him, lands, titles, an estate. But the true reward was access. He was the only man allowed to see her when her wig was off, when the candles burned low. In those hours, The Empress became simply Catherine again, and he mistook that for equality. He began to speak too freely. He argued. He drank. He told stories about their nights together, not to brag, but because he thought the world already knew. In a court built on rumor, that was fatal. Catherine noticed the shift before anyone else. He started arriving late. His letters became shorter. He looked at her as though he was remembering, not admiring. Power, she realized, doesn't end relationships. It outgrows them. She didn't rage. She recalculated. The empire had new enemies. She needed generals, not lovers. Orlov's usefulness was ending, and Catherine could never afford nostalgia. So she did what only the strongest rulers learn to do. She let him go without letting him leave. She gave him new duties, new medals, new reasons to stay away. He still believed he mattered. That belief was enough. Years later, when Orlov returned from a failed mission, bloated and broken by fever, she visited him one last time. He tried to kneel. She stopped him. "Rest," she said softly. "Russia owes you sleep." He smiled, confused, grateful. He died weeks later. Catherine wore black for a day. No more. In the quiet of her study, she sealed one of his old letters in a drawer. It began with the words, "You once said I was your strength." She didn't read the rest. She didn't need to, because the lesson was already written in her heart. Love may start revolutions, but only discipline keeps the crown. The palace never slept. Behind the marble calm, something was always whispering. Catherine had ruled barely a year before the stories began to crawl through the corridors. Quiet, poisonous, unstoppable. They said she had a new lover every month. They said she tested young officers like horses. They said Orlov was just one among many. And in the candlelit rooms where envy breeds best, people wanted to believe it. It was easier to call her immoral than to admit she was brilliant. Catherine knew the rhythm of rumor. It always began the same way, a half-truth, whispered over tea, repeated by someone too frightened to check. By nightfall, it had shape. By dawn, it had teeth. But she had learned something from Peter's fall. Never chase a story. Feed it or starve it. Never deny it. So she smiled when she heard her name paired with new ones. A poet, a guard, a musician. Sometimes she didn't even know the man in question. It didn't matter. Every lie made her seem more human, more vivid, and less predictable. The ambassadors reported back to Europe with fascination disguised as disgust. Parisian salons repeated the tales with glee. Voltaire himself wrote that Russia was now ruled by Minerva and Venus combined. Catherine laughed when she read it. It was an insult and a coronation all at once. Her enemies, of course, tried to weaponize it. Old nobles whispered that no woman who ruled by reason could also rule by desire. Priests muttered about divine punishment. Foreign kings wrote to their ministers, warning that female ambition was a disease that could spread. But Catherine had built her throne on perception, and she understood the paradox. To rule as a woman, she had to be both saint and sinner, perfect enough to inspire, flawed enough to be believed. So, she let the gossip run. While they gawked, she governed. While they speculated, she modernized. She reformed education, built hospitals, codified law. She founded journals and universities. She turned scandal into a smokescreen under which progress marched unnoticed. Yet the lies still stung. At night, in her study, she sometimes reread the letters she had written to Orlov. Short, cautious, unremarkable. She wondered which servant had stolen them, which rival had paid for the theft, which friend had sold the rumor that would haunt her forever. Still, she never wrote apologies. She never wrote. Never explanations. If history demanded to see her as dangerous, she would become danger itself. She hosted philosophers, musicians, playwrights, men who thought themselves clever enough to tame her mind. They left her presence dazzled, unsure whether they had met a ruler, a seductress, or a mirror reflecting their own desires. By the time Europe decided what to think of her, it no longer mattered. She had already rewritten Russia. She had turned gossip into power, scandal into armor. And behind the myth, A quiet truth endured. They didn't hate her because of her lovers. They hated her because she could rule without one. Every rumor was a confession, not of her sins, but of their fear. The courtiers laughed in secret. The bishops preached, the poets exaggerated, and Catherine, sitting alone beneath the chandeliers, dipped her quill and began another decree. She wrote as if time itself were watching, and in a way, it was. Because centuries later, we still remember the lies, and because of them, we still remember her. By the 1770s, Russia no longer doubted her. Catherine was the empire. Her face hung in every city. Her words carried the weight of law, her silence the promise of danger. But power, once reached, must be maintained, and maintenance required loyalty. She had seen what flattery could buy, but she also knew how quickly gratitude decayed. In a world where men inherited authority, she had to manufacture devotion. Her solution was audacious. She turned affection into an institution. Her favorites were chosen as carefully as generals, young, educated, obedient, and beautiful enough to serve as symbols of her taste. Each appointment began with a ritual of charm and ended with a signed deed, a title, an estate, a pension. No one left her presence empty-handed or unscarred. To some she gave power, to others ruin. Every man who shared her table understood the risk. They were not partners. They were instruments tuned to her ambition. And yet, they loved her, or believed they did. When a favorite grew careless, Catherine simply turned the page. A polite farewell, a promotion to some distant province, a generous sum for silence. There were no scenes, no tears. She ruled her heart as she ruled her empire. Efficiently. The court gossiped, as always. They said she changed lovers like gowns. They missed the truth. She changed strategies. Each man served a purpose. A soldier to stabilize the army, a diplomat to tame the nobles, a scholar to polish her image in Europe. One of them, Ivan Rimsky-Korsakov, thought himself exceptional. He composed music, flattered poets, called himself the Empress's Apollo. He lasted a year. Catherine dismissed him the moment his vanity outweighed his usefulness. He wept. She wrote an essay on education that same evening. Her ministers understood the lesson. If the Empress could discard affection, she could discard anyone. Loyalty became worship. Fear became etiquette. Yet Catherine was not made of marble. She felt, she desired, she dreamed, but never in public. Behind closed doors, she laughed easily, told crude jokes, read novels aloud. Then at dawn, she returned to her desk, the laughter gone, ink already staining her fingers. She ruled 16 hours a day. She read every report, every petition, every plea for mercy. She corrected the spelling of governors, rewrote speeches for ambassadors. When her advisors asked why she worked so hard, she said, "Because I am surrounded by men who don't." Abroad, philosophers adored her. Diderot visited, praising her as the light of the Enlightenment. She smiled, nodded, and out-argued him in his own theories. Later, she wrote privately, "He writes beautifully of liberty, in a country that does not exist." Russia existed. She made sure of it. In 40 years, she expanded its borders farther than any Romanov before her. She built cities where there had been forests, libraries where there had been silence. She made herself indispensable. Still, at night, when the palace grew quiet, she sometimes stood before the mirror, older now, tired, unmasked, and saw not an empress, but the girl who had once promised never to be powerless again. She had kept that promise. But power, she knew, had its own hunger. It devoured tenderness first. Outside, snow fell over St. Petersburg, slow, soundless, endless. Inside, Catherine dipped her quill and signed another decree. The empire slept. She never did. He appeared not as a lover, but as a storm, tall, sharp-eyed, unpredictable. Grigory Potemkin did not enter Catherine's life. He collided with it. When he first stood before her, he refused to bow deeply. Instead, he smiled. And that smile, reckless, amused, unafraid, startled her more than any flattery ever could. He spoke to her as an equal. He interrupted her. He argued. And in a court built on obedience, That was heresy. But Catherine was drawn to defiance. She had spent years surrounded by men who wanted to please her. Potemkin wanted to challenge her. He understood power as she did, not as possession, but as performance. Together, they created a partnership that blurred every line between affection and ambition. He became her mirror, her sparring partner, her strategist. While others adored her crown, Potemkin admired her mind. Their first letters were cautious, formal. Then, one day, he sent her a diamond-studded snuff box with a single note. "For the only hand I trust." She kept it by her bed for the rest of her life. Theirs was not a quiet love. They quarreled fiercely, shouted behind locked doors, then laughed hours later. He called her my Catherine of the North. She called him my conqueror. They spoke the same language, that of creation. While others sought her heart, Potemkin sought her empire. He helped her design cities, armies, fleets. When she dreamed of expanding south toward the Black Sea, it was Potemkin who drew the maps. He commanded her forces, built ports, founded towns, even created the fleet that would make Russia a naval power. Every victory bore his signature, and hers. Yet passion between equals is dangerous. It cannot last. It must evolve or collapse. Catherine knew it. So did he. When their love grew too large to contain, they chose distance instead of destruction. He left to govern new territories, and she remained in St. Petersburg. But they never truly parted. Letters passed between them, hundreds of them, filled with jokes, advice, and affection disguised as orders. Historians still debate whether they secretly married. Catherine never said. Potemkin never denied it. Perhaps it didn't matter. Their union existed beyond ceremony, a partnership built on mutual recognition. Each had found in the other what no one else could offer: comprehension. When Potemkin returned from campaign, tired and ill, she received him privately. He was thinner, grayer, but his voice still carried the same ungovernable warmth. She asked him if he still dreamed of the sea. He smiled. "Always. But now I dream of you commanding it." In his final years, she made sure he lacked for nothing. Titles, palaces, gold, all meaningless gestures compared to what she truly gave him: trust. When word reached her that he had died suddenly on the road in 1791, she locked herself in her chambers and wept without witnesses. For days, no one dared knock. Then, quietly, she resumed work. Later that month, she wrote in her journal, "He understood me completely. That is why we could not stay together." Potemkin had been her partner in conquest, her co-author in history. And when he was gone, the silence that replaced him was the only thing she could never master. After Potemkin's death, something in Catherine shifted. Her reign no longer needed passion to sustain it. It was self-propelling now, an engine built from habit and vigilance. The empire had become her reflection, vast, brilliant, unpredictable, and lonely. She carried on, as rulers must. Each morning the same ritual: the letters, the decrees, the endless petitions. Ministers spoke in cautious tones, afraid to disturb the stillness that had replaced laughter. Only her pen moved quickly. Ink became her only intimacy. The projects she had begun with Potemkin continued: the ports on the Black Sea, the new roads through the steppe, the gleaming city of Kherson rising from dust. To outsiders, it looked like glory. To Catherine, it looked like memory made permanent. Foreign ambassadors came to pay tribute. They spoke of civilization, progress, enlightenment. She smiled, knowing that behind their compliments hid resentment. A woman had done what their kings had not, turned chaos into order, wilderness into empire. She built schools for girls, hospitals for the poor, academies for science. She wrote to Europe's thinkers not as a student, but as an equal. When Voltaire died, she said, "I have lost my best pen." Then she took his place. But for every admirer, a shadow followed. Enemies abroad painted her as a tyrant in silk, a usurper wrapped in decadence. Pamphlets mocked her age, her lovers, her ambition. They called her insatiable, not for pleasure, but for power. She never denied it. At home, famine struck, revolts flared, the empire groaned beneath its size. Catherine responded not with pity, but with precision. She sent aid, yes, and armies too, mercy and discipline side by side. In private, she sometimes wondered whether greatness could exist without cruelty. Then she looked at the map, larger than ever, and decided it could not. She had learned that power was not given. It was built, piece by piece, out of perception. Every decision had to appear effortless, inevitable. She played her part to perfection, the wise mother, the enlightened monarch, the solitary mind above the storm. It was theater, and she was its only honest actor. When her ministers grew nervous, she reminded them, a throne is only stable when someone is seated on it. She never left it empty. By the 1790s, Catherine's empire stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. She had outlived her rivals, outlasted her critics, and outperformed every expectation placed upon her. Yet the triumph felt weightless. The applause of history had a hollow sound. One evening she stood on the balcony of Tsarskoye Selo, watching snow erase the gardens below. She thought of Potemkin's words, "You will command the sea." He had been right. She had commanded everything. And yet, as the wind rose, she realized the truth of empire. Power cannot be possessed. It can only be held until someone stronger, hungrier, or more ruthless takes it. Still, she smiled, because for 40 years no one had managed to take it from her. That was Potemkin's final gift. Not love, not memory, but certainty. He had taught her that control, once mastered, is its own kind of faith. And Catherine, Empress of all the Russias, believed in nothing more devoutly than that. For every empire built in daylight, there are hands working in the dark. Catherine's enemies did not ride with armies anymore. They wrote with ink. The age of the sword was ending. The age of rumor had begun. Abroad, Europe admired her reforms and mocked her sex in the same breath. To the French philosophers she was a muse, to their pamphleteers, a monster. The same pens that praised her intelligence sketched her body in filth. Nothing frightened men of letters more than a woman who read them. The first attacks came from Paris, wrapped in satire. Tiny printed sheets, smuggled through borders, sold in cafes and whispered behind fans. They called her greedy, vain, unchaste. They said she ruled from her bed, her throne merely an accessory. It was easy to sell. Scandal travels faster than statecraft. In London, caricaturists turned her into a spectacle. One week she seduced kings, the next she devoured generals. The drawings grew crueler, the lies wilder. They didn't need to know her. They needed to sell papers. Catherine saw the prints. Her ministers trembled, expecting rage. She only smiled. "If they draw me," she said, "it means I exist." But privately, she understood the danger. A crown can survive rebellion, not ridicule. Once the world laughs, authority begins to crack. So she fought back in her own way. She funded artists to paint her likeness, serene, maternal, illuminated by reason. She built statues, libraries, academies. Every building was a rebuttal, every portrait an argument. If they wanted scandal, she would give them grandeur. Her true enemies, however, were not across the sea. They lived within her walls. Old nobles who resented her reforms. Priests who muttered that the empire had traded God for French philosophy. Even her own son, Paul, grew restless in her shadow. He saw himself as the rightful ruler, and she as the obstacle. He surrounded himself with men who missed the old ways: cruelty, ceremony, obedience. Catherine ignored him at first. Then, when his temper grew dangerous, she began drafting plans to bypass him in the succession. That was when whispers turned into daggers. Letters vanished. Advisors defected. The Empress grew paranoid, though she never showed it. At night, she read reports from her spies, eyes flicking over the words plot, poison, betrayal. She underlined none of them. She didn't need to. Even in her final decade, Catherine's mind worked like a map, networks of loyalty and deceit drawn in invisible ink. She trusted no one entirely. Perhaps that was the price of power, to love people as tools, to fear them as threats. Outside, the world was changing faster than any empire could contain. Revolution burned in France, kings fell, and the same philosophers who once toasted her name now shouted of liberty. They no longer needed her as an example, they needed her as a warning. And somewhere in those same streets, a new myth began to take shape. One that would outlive every reform, every law, every victory. A story whispered by men who feared her, repeated by those who envied her, and believed by everyone who didn't know her at all. It started small, a joke, a rumor, a shadow, and soon it would become the most infamous lie in royal history. It began as a whisper, a single, cruel joke, born in Paris, a city drunk on revolution and gossip. A few words, tossed between men who had never seen her face, would soon stain her legacy forever. They said the Empress of Russia had died in an unspeakable way, that her body, vast as her ambition, had been crushed beneath the weight of a stallion. The story was absurd, obscene, impossible. But absurdity was its weapon. In an age that adored reason, nothing spread faster than a lie that mocked it. To imagine a great ruler, a woman, dying in such humiliation gave Europe something it craved: moral revenge. The authors were anonymous, but their motives were clear. To French radicals, Catherine was the embodiment of tyranny. To British cartoonists, she was the fantasy of decadence. To Russian nobles, she was the reminder that power could belong to someone they would never control. The story crossed borders with the speed of contempt. Pamphlets, caricatures, tavern songs, each retelling more grotesque than the last. It no longer mattered that Catherine was alive, healthy, ruling with unmatched brilliance. The myth had replaced the woman. In St. Petersburg, her advisors tried to protect her. They confiscated letters, silenced printers, bribed foreign merchants to intercept shipments of papers. It didn't work. Ideas travel where armies cannot. Catherine heard of it eventually. She laughed at first, a sharp, bitter laugh that cut the room in half. Then she grew quiet. She had endured years of whispers about lovers, conspiracies, vanity. But this was different. This was dehumanization dressed as humor. Still, she refused to address it. To deny the lie would give it weight. To confront it would make it immortal. So she did what only a master of image could do. She outshone it. She commissioned new portraits, calm, radiant, imperial. She invited diplomats, scholars, writers to witness her intelligence firsthand. She turned scandal into spectacle, hosting salons that displayed wit sharper than any pamphlet's venom. And for a while, it worked. But myths have no lifespan. They have momentum. The horse story kept galloping across Europe, transforming from mockery into legend, from legend into truth. Even those who didn't believe it repeated it, because it was too shocking to ignore. Years later, when she truly died, alone, at her desk, pen in hand, the world refused to accept the simplicity of it. The myth had already written her ending. That was the final insult. Not just that they mocked her body, but that they stole her death. They had taken from her what even kings are allowed: dignity in silence. Historians would spend centuries correcting it. Artists would paint her as wisdom itself. Philosophers would praise her intellect. But in the minds of millions, she remained the woman with the horse. Proof that genius, when female, must always be punished. Catherine had built an empire, reformed its laws, reshaped its mind. Yet her greatest enemy had never worn a crown or carried a sword. It had been a story. And stories, she knew too well, never die. Long after Catherine's death, her palaces remained filled with portraits, calm, regal, untouched by scandal. Yet outside those walls, the myth walked freely. It had no face, no date, no author, but it endured with the stubborn life of rumor. Europe had changed. Empires rose and fell, monarchies trembled, revolutions devoured their children. But the story of the Empress and the horse survived it all. It appeared in travel diaries, gossip columns, dinner jokes. It became the kind of tale that no one believed, yet everyone repeated. The lie endured because it was convenient. It reduced a brilliant ruler to a body, a stateswoman to a spectacle. It turned intelligence into excess, courage into corruption, ambition into sin. It told men that a woman could rule only if she was monstrous. Historians tried to correct it. They published letters, decrees, reforms, evidence of her genius, proof of her restraint. But facts are fragile when placed against a story that flatters prejudice. Every correction sounded defensive. Every defense made the myth stronger. Even Russia, the empire she had built, was divided about her. For some, she was the mother of modern Russia. For others, she was a foreigner who had seduced her way to power. The contradiction suited her legend, both admired and despised, saint and sinner, genius and scandal. By the 19th century, the rumor had become folklore. Writers used it as shorthand for decadence. Moralists used it as warning. Painters resurrected her as a symbol of fallen pride. Poets as a metaphor for desire unbound. The real woman, the ruler who had drafted constitutions, negotiated treaties, read philosophy by candlelight, disappeared beneath the ink of others. It wasn't just cruelty that kept the lie alive, it was need. Societies born from her reforms still feared what she represented: intellect without permission, authority without apology. The myth survived because it comforted those who could not imagine such power belonging to a woman. Catherine herself had understood this mechanism. In her writings, she noted that reputation is a species of government. She ruled her image as fiercely as she ruled her armies. But image, once released into the world, obeys no master. It becomes property of those who tell it next. And so, her true legacy became hidden within the very slander meant to destroy it. For every fool who repeated the obscene tale, another asked, who was this woman they feared so much? Curiosity is its own revenge. Each repetition of the lie also kept her name alive. 2 centuries later, the myth still circulates, in whispers, in jokes, in careless lines of text. But something has changed. The laughter that once mocked her now feels uneasy. The world that ridiculed her has filled its parliaments, its laboratories, its studios with women who owe their defiance to hers. Catherine won, in the only way victory lasts, not by erasing the lie, but by outliving it. History has learned to look past the ridicule, to see the builder behind the rumor, the architect beneath the scandal. The story that was meant to shame her became proof of her endurance. And every time her name is spoken, even in mockery, the myth bends toward admiration, not contempt. For the lie persists, yes, but so does she. History remembers the empress. Few remember the woman. In her final years, Catherine lived surrounded by luxury and by ghosts. The Winter Palace gleamed brighter than ever, but its halls felt empty. The laughter of courtiers echoed without warmth. The throne, once a prize, had become a chair she could not leave. Every morning she woke before dawn, as she always had. Old habits survived when people didn't. She read reports, corrected drafts, annotated everything in her small, disciplined hand. The ink on her fingers had become a second skin. But the letters she kept closest were not political. They were private. Fragments of affection, bits of tenderness from men long gone. Orlov's rough handwriting, Potemkin's precise script, marked with sweat and travel dust. She never reread them aloud. She simply touched the paper, as if to verify that once she had been known. In public, she remained flawless. At dinners, she spoke with calm authority. At court, she moved with the serenity of inevitability. Visitors left believing she was eternal. Her ministers, younger now, whispered that she would never die, and perhaps, in some way, they were right. But even gods grow weary of worship. Her mind, though still sharp, often drifted. Sometimes, in the middle of a report, she would stop and stare at the flame of a candle. Once, her chamberlain found her tracing invisible circles on her desk. When he asked what she was thinking, she smiled faintly. "I am measuring time," she said. There were moments of softness still. She adored her grandchildren, laughed with them, spoiled them with the affection she had never given her own son. Paul remained distant, simmering with resentment. She could feel his ambition pressing against the walls of the palace like winter wind, but she had decided long ago that sentiment was a luxury rulers could not afford. Catherine's solitude was not punishment, it was consequence. She had built an empire so vast that no one could stand beside her. She had become a monument in her own lifetime, carved from duty and brilliance. And monuments, however beautiful, cannot embrace. At night, she walked alone through her library. Thousands of books lined the walls, the philosophers who had shaped her, the poets who had adored her, the historians who would one day judge her. She ran her fingers along the spines, murmuring their names like old friends. She no longer believed in immortality, only in memory. One evening she wrote in her journal, "I have been the pupil of circumstance and the teacher of my own heart." Then she closed the book and blew out the candle. In the darkness that followed, she felt neither triumph nor regret, only awareness. The crown had given her everything the world could offer, and taken everything the world could not replace. The woman behind the crown was still there, small and quiet, hidden inside the legend she had built brick by brick. But she no longer fought to be seen. History would speak for her now, and history, she knew, never speaks kindly, only endlessly. For centuries the word pleasure followed Catherine like a curse. It clung to her name in books, in paintings, in jokes whispered by men who feared her. They thought they understood what she loved. They were wrong. Her pleasures had never been the kind that fade with the night. They were the quiet, consuming joys of the mind, the feeling of an empire bending toward order, of chaos shaped into symmetry, the satisfaction of turning an idea into a city, a vision into a law. When others sought passion in bodies, she found it in creation. She built schools, hospitals, theaters. She filled Russia with light, literal and intellectual, because ignorance disgusted her more than loneliness. In every project, she saw a reflection of herself, stubborn, magnificent, unfinished. She took delight in structure, in the geometry of progress, in the rhythm of logic. Her nights with philosophers, those endless debates about liberty and justice, excited her more deeply than any touch. They mistook her curiosity for vanity. It was hunger, for knowledge, for refinement, for permanence. Even her gardens spoke her language. The paths were laid in perfect symmetry, yet a single bend would always lead somewhere unexpected. Visitors thought it design. It was philosophy, her belief that beauty without surprise was only decoration. Those who knew her best said she came alive not in ballrooms but in libraries. She could spend hours arguing with a mathematician, drafting reforms, or sketching plans for a new city by candlelight. Her pleasure was not indulgence, it was mastery, and yet she never condemned desire itself. She saw it for what it was, the energy that drives creation. To her, passion and intellect were not enemies but twins. What others called sin, she recognized as power, misnamed. Perhaps that is why her enemies confused her genius with lust. They could not imagine that a woman's fire could burn for anything but flesh. So they reduced her to their own limits, mistaking her appetite for learning as appetite of another kind. But in truth, Catherine's desires were architectural. She wanted to build a Russia that could outlive her, to prove that reason could rule even a land of ice and superstition, to make civilization itself her legacy. And she did. The universities she founded still stand. The cities she raised still hum with life. The words she wrote still echo with clarity. The rest, the gossip, the myths, the obscene inventions, belonged to those who could not comprehend her scope. They needed her to be mortal in the smallest way so they could survive her greatness. Catherine once said, "I shall be an autocrat. That is my trade. The good of my people is my purpose." That, too, was pleasure, the ecstasy of purpose fulfilled. To shape destiny with bare hands and steady mind. To find joy not in being desired, but in being effective. In the end, her pleasure was the act of doing, The empire itself was her masterpiece, her lover, her mirror, her child. And when she looked upon it, she did not see sin or scandal. She saw creation. That was her secret, misunderstood but undefeated. Catherine's greatest pleasure was not possession. It was permanence. On the morning of November 17th, 1796, Catherine the Great rose before the sun. The palace was silent except for the faint hiss of fire in the hearth. She read dispatches, signed decrees, and called for her map of the empire. There was no sign, no warning, just the steady pulse of routine. Moments later, she collapsed. Her attendants rushed in, terrified to touch her. They carried her to her chamber, where the woman who had ruled for 40 years lay between worlds, not in grandeur, but in stillness. Outside, the bells of St. Petersburg told their usual rhythm. The empire did not yet know that its architect was gone. When the news spread, the first reaction was disbelief. It was easier to imagine Russia without winter than without Catherine. And yet, death had come quietly, without spectacle, without audience. No thunder, no drama, only silence. But the world that had refused her peace in life could not grant it in death. The lie returned before her body was even cold. "Have you heard?" they whispered. "The horse." And so, the empress who had built libraries and cities, who had rewritten the laws of a nation, was once again reduced to a myth made for mockery. The irony was almost perfect. Catherine had believed that reason could civilize the world. Instead, the world had proven that rumor was immortal. Her son Paul took the throne she had kept from him. He resented her even in death. He reversed her decrees, dismissed her allies, and ordered her apartment sealed. Yet even he could not erase her. Her initials remained carved into the foundations of the empire. E2, etched in marble, untouchable. In the years that followed, time began to soften her image. Artists painted her as serene, philosophers reclaimed her as enlightened, historians as visionary. But the myth always lingered at the edge, like a shadow that refused to fade, proof of how uneasily the world makes peace with powerful women. And yet, there is a certain justice in her legend, because what her enemies meant as insult became her immortality. The gossip they forged to destroy her ensured that she would never be forgotten. Every slander, every caricature, every whispered lie kept her name alive long after their own had turned to dust. She had once written, "Fame and love cannot live in the same house." Perhaps she was right. She had not been loved in her lifetime, not truly, but she was famous beyond death. And fame, though cold, is eternal. If she could speak now, she might laugh at the absurdity of it. The world still arguing over her body, her lovers, her reputation. While her empire endures, her reforms remain, and her name still commands curiosity centuries later. She won, in the end, by outlasting every insult. The myth survived. But so did the mind that created it. The myth survived, but so did the mind that created it. And as the candle of her life burned to its final glow, one could almost imagine her whispering the same words she once wrote in her youth. "I may be blamed. I may be envied. I may even be forgotten. But I will not be ignored." The flame went out. The empire continued, and in the quiet that followed, history exhaled, remembering not the scandal, but the silence of a woman who refused to disappear. History, like the sea, never stays still. It smooths the rough edges of memory, buries the noise, and leaves behind only what endures. Catherine the Great is remembered in fragments: the ruler, the reformer, the scandal, the myth. But beneath all those layers remains something simpler and far more human. A woman who refused to live small. She ruled because she could. She learned because she must. And though the world tried to shame her into silence, she answered with creation. Palaces, libraries, ideas, and words. The rumor survived, but so did she. And centuries later, when her name is spoken, even in jest, it still commands attention. That, perhaps, is the truest kind of victory. Not purity, but permanence. So when you think of Catherine the Great, do not imagine the caricature or the scandal. Imagine the light of a candle on her desk. A woman riding into the night, steady hand, unshaken mind, building an empire out of thought and ink. And remember, the lies of history fade, but the voices that dared to rise above them, they never truly fall silent. Now close your eyes and let the empire sleep.